September 7, 1945. 23 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 12 days after General MacArthur landed in Tokyo. 6 days after the formal surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. The deadliest war in human history was officially over. 50 million people dead. Cities turned to ash. 2 atomic bombs had vaporized Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on the island of Okinawa, where 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had perished in 82 days of apocalyptic fighting, 23 women sat in darkness, waiting for a fate they believed was worse than death. Here is what Japanese military propaganda had promised them. American soldiers would violate them, torture them, pass them around like objects until their bodies broke. Death would be a mercy they would beg for, but never receive. This was not rumor. This was official warning from commanding officers. This was absolute certainty drilled into every Japanese woman from childhood, and it was so effective that throughout the Pacific War, thousands of women chose suicide over surrender. Mothers threw their children off cliffs before jumping themselves. Nurses carried poison pills sewn into their uniforms. Civilians drowned themselves in the ocean rather than face capture. So when those American boots crunched across the gravel toward the ruined schoolhouse that night, every woman inside knew exactly what was coming. They had linked arms. They had said their prayers. Some had weapons hidden in their clothing. They were ready to fight and ready to die. What happened next would destroy everything they believed about war, about enemies, about honor, and about their own government. And I promise you, the weapon the Americans used that night was more powerful than any bomb ever dropped. Ko was 24 years old. She had trained as a nurse in Kyoto before the war transformed her into something else entirely. For 3 months, she had worked in underground tunnels during the Battle of Okinawa, holding down wounded soldiers while medics amputated limbs without anesthesia. She had watched men die screaming her name. She had crawled through darkness while American flamethrowers turned the world above into an inferno. She had eaten insects and drunk water from puddles and gone so long without sleep that she hallucinated conversations with her dead grandmother. Now she sat in the corner of a bombed-out schoolhouse, clutching a cloth bag that contained everything left of her former life. A photograph of her parents, a letter she never sent, and wrapped carefully at the bottom a knife. She had practiced the motion in her mind 1,000 times. When the Americans came for her, she would use it. Not on them, on herself. She would not give them what they wanted. She would die with whatever fragment of honor remained. This was not desperation. This was duty. This was what loyal Japanese women did. Beside her, Yumi was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered. 18 years old, the youngest among them. She kept whispering the same words over and over. They are coming. It is dark now. They will come. Her voice was not questioning. She was stating fact. Everyone knew what happened to Japanese women after dark in American hands. The propaganda had been too detailed, too consistent, too emphatic to doubt. Sachiko was the oldest at 40. She had already lost everything. Her son had died on Iwo Jima. Her husband was missing, probably dead, in the firebombing of their hometown. She had nothing left to lose, which should have made her fearless. Instead, it made her hollow. She sat motionless, staring at nothing, waiting for the final indignity before death released her. The tropical darkness was complete now. No electricity, no moon. Only the distant glow of American floodlights and the sounds of an occupying army going about its evening routines. Laughter drifted across the night air. Music played from somewhere. The casual sounds of men who had won. Then the boots. Heavy. Multiple. Coming closer. 23 women pressed together in the farthest corner from the door. Some covered their faces. Others stared with eyes so wide the whites gleamed in the darkness. Ko's hand found her knife. Yumi's fingernails dug into the arm next to her hard enough to draw blood. Sachiko began reciting a Buddhist prayer under her breath, words tumbling out in desperate rhythm. The door creaked open. A flashlight beam cut through the blackness, sweeping across the room like a searchlight hunting escaped prisoners. 3 silhouettes filled the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, American. This is it, Ko thought. Her fingers tightened on the knife handle. She pictured her mother's face. She prepared to die. And then the American spoke. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. He said something in English that none of them understood, but the tone was completely wrong. Not aggressive, not threatening, not what they expected at all. He sounded almost concerned, almost gentle. The soldier stepped forward, and every woman flinched backward against the wall. But he stopped immediately, held up his hands, palms out. The universal gesture of no harm intended. Another soldier moved past him carrying something bulky. In the flashlight beam, Ko saw it clearly. Blankets. Thick wool military blankets. The soldier held them out, offering them to the women. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The scene made no sense. Where was the violence? Where was the assault? Where were the horrors they had spent months preparing to face? A third soldier set down a large metal container and lifted the lid. Steam rose into the cold night air. The unmistakable smell of hot tea filled the room. He poured cups with careful efficiency and placed them on the floor within reach. Then all 3 soldiers stepped back. One said something else in that soft, incomprehensible English. Then they turned and left. The door closed. Their footsteps faded across the gravel, and 23 women stared at blankets and tea as if hallucinating. "It is a trick." Sachiko's voice cut through the stunned silence. "They want us to lower our guard. They will come back." Every woman nodded. Of course. That made sense. The Americans were clever. This was psychological warfare. Accept the comfort, relax your vigilance, and then the real nightmare begins. But the schoolhouse was cold. The night air cut through their torn clothing. Some women were already shaking from more than fear. And those blankets were right there. That tea was still steaming. Yumi moved first. Maybe because she was young enough to still act on impulse. Maybe because she was too cold to care about tricks anymore. She crawled forward, hand trembling violently, and touched the nearest blanket, soft wool, real warmth. She pulled it around her shoulders, and something broke inside her. A sound escaped her lips that was half sob, half sigh. The other women watched, waiting for punishment. But nothing happened. Yumi sat wrapped in an American blanket, tears streaming down her face. One by one they reached for blankets. Ko took one with hands that would not stop shaking. The warmth hit her like a physical force. She had been cold for so long. Months of caves and tunnels and wet clothing, and never enough food to generate body heat. The blanket felt like being held by something safe. She picked up a cup of tea. Still hot. She sipped and tasted sweetness. Sugar. An impossible luxury. The warmth spread through her chest and into her stomach, and she felt tears coming and could not stop them. Around her, 22 other women were crying too. Not from pain, not from fear, from something far more confusing. They had prepared for horror and received kindness. They had braced for assault and been given comfort. The contradiction was so absolute that their minds simply could not process it. Why, Yumi whispered into the darkness. Why would they do this? Nobody answered, because there was no answer that fit inside the framework of everything they had been taught. If Americans were monsters, this made no sense. If Americans were beasts without honor or mercy, this was impossible, which meant either they had witnessed a miracle or everything they believed was a lie. That night, wrapped in American blankets with American tea warming their bellies, 23 Japanese women slept. Real sleep. Deep sleep. The first true rest many had experienced in months. They did not wake to assault. They did not wake to nightmare. They woke to sunlight streaming through holes in the roof and the simple, impossible fact of being alive and unharmed. The Americans returned in the morning. Different soldiers, same gentleness. They brought breakfast. Oatmeal with sugar. Canned milk. Coffee. More food than any of these women had seen in months. They brought medical supplies and treated infected wounds with careful efficiency. They brought clean water and soap that smelled like flowers. Ko watched them come and go throughout the day. None touched the women. None threatened. None did anything except provide care with quiet professionalism. And each act of kindness drove the knife deeper into the propaganda that had controlled her thinking for years. That evening she opened her cloth bag and looked at the knife she had planned to use on herself. It seemed absurd now. She had been ready to die rather than face American captivity. But the Americans had not hurt her. They had fed her. They had given her warmth. They had treated her with more humanity in one day than the Japanese military had shown its own nurses in the final months of the war. The realization crept up slowly, but struck like a bomb. If the Americans were not monsters, then everything she had believed was a lie. And if her government had lied about the Americans, what else had they lied about? The divine destiny of Japan, the certainty of victory, the honor of dying rather than surrendering. How many women had killed themselves based on false promises of American brutality? How many mothers had murdered their own children to spare them from horrors that never would have come? How many people had chosen death because Japanese propaganda painted the enemy as subhuman? Ko looked around at the other women. She saw the same terrible recognition dawning in their eyes. Yumi was crying again, but differently now. Not from relief, from anger, from the growing understanding that she had almost died for a lie. Sachiko sat very still, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring at the photograph of her dead son. He had died on Iwo Jima believing Americans were monsters. He had fought to the death rather than surrender because he believed capture meant torture. And now Sachiko sat here, captured, fed, cared for, forced to confront the possibility that her son's death had been built on deliberate deception. That contradiction was more devastating than any violence could have been. Because violence confirms what you believe about enemies. It validates your hatred. It justifies your resistance. But kindness shatters the foundation. Kindness forces you to rebuild your entire understanding of the world from the ground up. And that is exactly what happened to these women. Day after day, the Americans returned with food and medicine and small kindnesses. Week after week, no assault came, no torture, no horror. Only the steady accumulation of evidence that everything they had been taught was propaganda designed to make them compliant participants in their own destruction. Ko started keeping a journal. She wrote about blankets and tea, about American soldiers who showed her photographs of their families back home, about the Geneva Convention that the Americans followed even though Japan had rejected it, about the mounting fury she felt toward leaders who had told her to die rather than experience this basic human decency. "We were prisoners of lies," she wrote one night. "Our own government imprisoned our minds long before the Americans captured our bodies. And now, caged by the enemy, we are finally free to see truth." By the end of the first month, the physical transformation was remarkable. Women who had arrived as walking skeletons now showed color in their cheeks. Eyes that had been hollow and dead began to sparkle with something like life. Bodies that had been starving on Japanese rations grew strong on American food. But the psychological transformation cut deeper. These women were not just healing physically. They were dismantling an entire belief system that had controlled them since childhood. They were confronting the terrifying possibility that their own government had valued propaganda more than their lives, that the enemy they had been taught to hate was more honorable than the leaders who demanded their loyalty. That realization would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and what they discovered in the weeks ahead would prove even more disturbing. Because the kindness they received in captivity stood in brutal contrast to what was happening to their families back in Japan. While these women ate 3 meals a day, their parents and siblings starved in the ruins of bombed cities. While they slept warm under American blankets, their loved ones froze in makeshift shelters. The enemy was feeding prisoners, while their own nation left its citizens to die. In Part 2, we will see how letters from home shattered whatever remained of these women's loyalty to Japan, how the contrast between their captivity and their families' suffering forced them to ask the most dangerous question of all. If the Americans treated enemies with such dignity, and Japan treated its own people with such contempt who exactly had been the monster all along? The answer would break something inside them that could never be repaired. In Part 1, 23 Japanese women prepared to die rather than face American captivity. They had been told with absolute certainty what would happen: violation, torture, horrors beyond imagination. But when those American soldiers walked through the door that September night in 1945, they brought wool blankets and hot tea. No assault came, no torture. Only kindness that made no sense. Day after day, week after week, the Americans fed them, clothed them, treated their wounds, and slowly demolished every lie Japanese propaganda had built. By the end of the first month, these women were physically healthier than they had been in years. But the psychological transformation was just beginning, because kindness from enemies is uncomfortable. It can be dismissed as strategy. It can be rationalized as temporary. The mind finds ways to preserve its beliefs even when evidence screams otherwise. Some women clung desperately to the old framework. They insisted this was a trick. They warned the others not to trust. They waited for the real nightmare to begin. But then the letters arrived. And what those letters revealed would shatter whatever remained of their loyalty to Japan. Because while these women ate 3 meals a day in American captivity, their families were starving to death in the ruins of their homeland. The enemy was feeding prisoners. Their own nation was letting its citizens die. Here is where the real horror begins. 2 weeks into captivity, the Americans arranged mail delivery. It was standard procedure for prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Simple humanitarian protocol. But for these women, those thin envelopes would deliver a blow more devastating than any bomb. Ko recognized her brother's handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled as she tore open the envelope. The paper inside was cheap, almost translucent, covered in shaky characters that looked nothing like the confident script she remembered. She read the letter once, then again, then a third time, each reading driving the words deeper into her chest like nails. Her parents were alive. They lived in the bombed ruins of what had been their home in Kyoto. No roof, no walls, just rubble arranged into something resembling shelter. Her father was sick. Her mother spent hours each day searching through wreckage for anything edible. Her brother, only 15 years old, worked 12 hours daily, clearing debris for a handful of rice that was never enough. He asked if Ko had any food to send. He asked when she was coming home. He asked if she was even still alive. Ko looked down at the half-eaten chocolate bar beside her, at the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, at the cup of hot tea still steaming in her hands. American tea, American chocolate, American warmth, while her family starved. The guilt hit her like a physical blow. She could not breathe. She could not think. She had survived. She had been cared for. She had grown healthy on enemy food while her little brother begged for rice in the ashes of Japan. Around her, other women were opening their own letters, and the sounds that followed would haunt Ko forever. Yumi's letter was short. 3 sentences that destroyed her world. Her mother had died in the firebombing of Osaka. Her father was missing, presumed dead. Her younger sister lived in a refugee camp, sick with dysentery, unlikely to survive the winter. Yumi read those words and made no sound at all. She simply sat frozen. The letter clutched in her hands, her face completely blank. Then she looked down at the American bread she had been eating and began to shake. Sachiko learned that her son had died on Iwo Jima. She already suspected it. But suspicion is not certainty. The letter confirmed what she had feared for months. Her husband had died in Hiroshima. Not missing, not presumed, dead. Vaporized in an instant along with 80,000 others. She had no one left. Her entire family erased while she sat wrapped in an enemy blanket, belly full of enemy food, crying into enemy tea. That night, no one slept. The women sat in darkness, each alone with her letter, each confronting a truth too painful to speak aloud. The contrast was unbearable. They were safe. They were fed. They were warm, and their people were dying. Ko stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside her. Not grief, something colder, something sharper. Anger. Pure burning rage directed not at the Americans who had shown her kindness, but at the government that had made this situation possible. The leaders who had started an unwinnable war. The officers who had demanded death before surrender. The propagandists who had painted Americans as monsters to justify their own monstrous choices. How many women had killed themselves rather than face this supposed horror? How many had murdered their own children? How many families had been destroyed not by American cruelty, but by Japanese lies? And now those same leaders had abandoned their own people to starve while the enemy fed prisoners of war. The enemy followed rules. Japan had rejected those rules. The enemy showed mercy. Japan had demanded death. The enemy valued human life. Japan had treated its citizens as expendable. Ko whispered into the darkness. We were told to die for Japan, but Japan was never going to save us. Not in battle, not in surrender, not even now when the war is over and our families starve in rubble. The Americans save us because their rules require it. Our own government let us believe suicide was the only honorable choice because our survival was never their priority. Nobody argued. Nobody could. The evidence was too overwhelming. The days that followed were different. The physical routine remained the same. Breakfast, medical care, lunch, rest, dinner. But the emotional atmosphere had transformed. Where there had been confusion, now there was clarity. Where there had been cognitive dissonance, now there was cold understanding. These women knew the truth now, and the truth was simple. Their government had lied about everything. The discussions that erupted each evening grew more intense. Women who had been reluctant to question now spoke with fierce conviction. Haruko, who had insisted longest that American kindness was a trick, finally broke. I believed them, she said, her voice cracking. I believed every word. When my husband went to war, I told him to die rather than surrender. I told him death was preferable to American captivity. And now I sit here fed and clothed and cared for, and I realize what I told him was a death sentence based on lies. If he surrendered, he would have lived. If he trusted the enemy, he would have survived. Instead, he died believing what I believed, what we all believed, what they made us believe. She was crying now openly without shame. What kind of government tells its women to kill themselves rather than face enemies who bring blankets and tea? What kind of leaders would rather have us dead than admit their propaganda was false? Nobody had answers. Only more questions that spiraled into darker territories with each passing night. An American officer named Lieutenant Patterson came to speak with them through an interpreter. He wanted to explain why prisoners were treated humanely. He spoke about the Geneva Convention, about American values, about the belief that every human life had worth regardless of nationality or circumstance. Ko listened and felt the last fragments of her old worldview crumble to dust. You are not our enemies anymore, Patterson said. The war is over. You are just people who need help. We provide that help because it is right. Because holding on to hatred serves no purpose. Punishing you would not bring back the dead. But treating you with dignity might build a better future. Ko asked the question that burned inside her. We fought against you. Some of us helped kill American soldiers. How can you care for us? Patterson thought before answering. The war made us enemies. Peace makes us neighbors. What you did during the war, you did believing you were right. The same was true for us. Now we have a choice. We can carry hatred forever, or we can choose something better. We choose something better. Those words struck Ko like lightning. Hatred was a choice. Mercy was a choice. Her government had chosen to demand death and call it honor. The Americans had chosen to offer kindness and call it duty. The contrast revealed everything about what each side truly valued. By the second month, something remarkable had happened. The women had stopped seeing Americans as enemies. They had started seeing them as individuals, Private Miller, young and earnest, who practiced Japanese phrases each morning. The medic with gentle hands who treated their wounds without judgment. The cook who always made sure there was extra food. These were not monsters. These were not beasts. These were ordinary men following rules that prioritized human dignity. Ko found herself standing outside the schoolhouse one evening watching the sunset over the ocean when Miller approached. He offered her a cigarette. She did not smoke, but took it anyway. They stood in silence watching the sky turn colors, two former enemies sharing a moment of peace. Miller pulled out his wallet and showed her a photograph. A woman and two small children standing in front of a white house. His family. He looked at the picture with such obvious love that Ko felt her throat tighten. This was the enemy. This man who probably killed Japanese soldiers in battle. And he was just a person. A husband. A father. Someone who missed his family and showed kindness to prisoners because it was the right thing to do. Ko showed him her own photograph. Her parents in Kyoto before the war, before everything fell apart. Miller looked at it seriously, nodded, said something sympathetic that she did not fully understand but completely felt. Then he handed it back carefully, and they finished their cigarettes in silence. That moment crystallized everything. The propaganda had been designed to dehumanize, to make killing easier, to make dying preferable. But you cannot maintain hatred for someone who shows you pictures of their children. You cannot see monsters in eyes that look at family photographs with love. The propaganda required distance. Proximity destroyed it. In the third month, the Americans took identification photographs of all prisoners, standard documentation for eventual repatriation. But when the women saw those photographs, they experienced a collective shock that crystallized their transformation. Ko stared at her image in disbelief. The woman in the picture looked healthy. Her cheeks were full. Her skin was clear. Her eyes were bright. She wore clean American-issued clothing. Her hair, which had been falling out from malnutrition when captured, now looked thick and healthy. This was not the face of a prisoner. This was the face of someone who had been rescued. She compared the photograph to her memories of the final months of war. Skeletal. Hollow. Exhausted. Dying slowly from starvation and despair under Japanese military care. Now, as a prisoner of the enemy, she looked healthier than she had as a free citizen of her own country. The irony was crushing. Enemy captivity had restored her. Freedom under her own government had nearly killed her. That night, the women gathered and spoke the truth that had been building for months. Ko's voice was steady, despite the weight of her words. Our government lied about the Americans, about the war, about what honor means. They sent our men to die for nothing. They left our families to starve. And when we surrendered, when we finally stopped fighting an unwinnable war, the enemy showed us more humanity than our own leaders ever did. Yumi added her voice. I was taught the emperor was divine, that Japan's cause was sacred, that Americans were devils. But if the emperor is divine, why did he let Japan burn? If our cause was sacred, why are our cities ash? If Americans are devils, why do they feed us and treat us with respect? Either everything was a lie, or the gods themselves have abandoned us, and I no longer believe in gods who abandon their people. Sachiko spoke last, her voice heavy with grief and hard-won wisdom. Kindness cuts deeper than cruelty. Cruelty confirms what you believe about enemies. Kindness destroys it. The Americans showed us mercy when we expected horror. And that mercy has demolished the fortress of lies we lived in more completely than any bomb. The transformation was complete. They had entered captivity as loyal subjects of Imperial Japan. They would leave as women who had seen through the propaganda, who understood the cost of blind loyalty, who recognized humanity in unexpected places. But repatriation was coming. Soon they would return to a Japan that lay in ruins, occupied by the very Americans they now saw as more honorable than their own former government. They would face families who had suffered while they recovered. They would encounter a society that might view surrendered women as traitors, as collaborators, as stained by contact with the enemy. And they would carry a truth that many in Japan would not want to hear. That the Americans were not monsters. That surrender had not been dishonor. That the real betrayal had come from leaders who demanded death, rather than admit their propaganda was lies. Ko wrote in her journal words that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The blankets and tea that first night were not just gifts. They were proof that the world is more complicated than propaganda allows. They were evidence that humanity can survive even when war tries to destroy it. And they were a lesson I will never forget. Question everything. Trust actions over words. And never believe anyone who tells you that your enemies are not human. Because that lie is how wars begin. And that lie is how leaders convince ordinary people to die for nothing. But the journey home would bring new challenges. Because Japan in 1946 was a shattered nation searching for someone to blame. And women who had been treated well by Americans who had grown healthy on enemy food, who had learned uncomfortable truths about their own government, would not find easy welcome in the ruins of their homeland. In Part 3, we will follow these women as they return to a Japan they no longer recognize. Where their families have become strangers. Where their health becomes evidence of suspected collaboration. Where speaking the truth about American kindness could mark them as traitors. And where the hardest question still waits to be answered. How do you rebuild your life when everything you believed has been proven false? The war was over, but the battle for truth was just beginning. In Part 1, 23 Japanese women prepared to die rather than face American captivity. They had been promised violation torture horrors beyond imagination. Instead, American soldiers brought them wool blankets and hot tea. Day after day, week after week, the enemy fed them, clothed them, treated them with dignity that made no sense. In Part 2, letters from home shattered whatever remained of their old beliefs. While they ate 3 meals a day in captivity, their families starved in the ruins of Japan. The contrast was devastating. The enemy cared for prisoners, while their own government abandoned its citizens. By the 3rd month, these women had undergone a complete psychological transformation. They had entered captivity as loyal subjects of Imperial Japan. They emerged as witnesses to a truth their homeland was not ready to hear. But now repatriation was coming. They would return to a Japan they no longer recognized, to families who had suffered while they recovered, to a society that viewed surrendered women with suspicion and shame, and they would carry knowledge that could mark them as traitors in a nation desperate to forget its failures. February 1946. The ship carrying the women approached Yokohama harbor, and the first sight of their homeland told them everything they needed to know about what awaited. The harbor was a graveyard of ships. Rusted hulls jutted from the water at broken angles. Cranes stood motionless, twisted by bombs into sculptures of destruction. Beyond the docks, Yokohama stretched out like a wound that refused to heal. Block after block of rubble. Hollow buildings with empty windows staring like skulls. People moving through the ruins like ghosts, thin and ragged, their movement slow with hunger and defeat. This was Japan now. This was what the war had left behind. The women stood at the ship's railing, wrapped in their American-issued coats, watching their homeland approach. None of them spoke. There were no words for what they felt. They had left Japan as soldiers and nurses fighting for divine destiny. They returned as well-fed prisoners in enemy clothing, carrying truths that nobody wanted to hear. Ko noticed the stairs first. Dock workers paused their labor to watch the ship come in. Their eyes moved over the women's clean clothes, their healthy faces, their bodies that showed no signs of starvation. The expressions were not welcoming. They were calculating, suspicious, resentful. These dock workers had survived on rations that barely sustained life. They had watched family members die from malnutrition. They had spent months in freezing ruins while the occupation forces ate well. And now here came Japanese women stepping off ships looking healthier than anyone had a right to look in 1946. The whispers started before they even reached the dock. "Look at them! So well fed! What did they do to earn that food?" Ko heard the words clearly. She understood their meaning even more clearly. In a starving nation, health was suspicious. Survival required explanation. And there was only one explanation the crowd was willing to believe: collaboration, betrayal, selling themselves to the enemy. It was not true. The Americans had asked nothing in return for their care. But truth does not matter when people are hungry and angry and looking for someone to blame. The women were processed through a repatriation center with cold efficiency. Officials asked questions in clipped tones: name, age, circumstances of capture, duration of captivity. The questions were routine. The judgment behind them was not. One official looked at Ko's identification photograph, the one taken by Americans, showing her healthy and well-dressed. Then he looked at her standing before him, still showing the effects of months of good nutrition. His lip curled almost imperceptibly. "You were well treated," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Yes," Ko answered. "According to the Geneva Convention." The official's expression did not change. He stamped her papers and gestured for her to move along. But his eyes said what his words did not. He had already decided what she was, what all of them were. The journey home was worse. Trains barely functioned. Schedules meant nothing. Ko spent 3 days traveling from Yokohama to Kyoto, a journey that had once taken hours. She sat in crowded cars surrounded by Japanese civilians who looked like survivors of plague. Skeletal faces, hollow eyes, clothes that hung on wasted frames. And there she sat among them, healthy, clean, obviously different. An old woman across the aisle stared at her for hours without speaking. Finally, she leaned forward. "Where were you that you look like that?" Ko hesitated. "Okinawa. I was a prisoner." The old woman's expression shifted. Not to sympathy, to something harder. "My grandson died on Okinawa." She turned away and did not speak again. That encounter repeated in different forms throughout the journey. Former soldiers with missing limbs who looked at her with bitter confusion. Mothers holding starving children who could not understand why a prisoner looked healthier than citizens. Elderly people who had lost everything and could not forgive anyone who had lost less. Ko learned to keep silent, to avoid explaining, to make herself small and invisible. But she could not change her face. She could not hide the evidence of American care that was written on her body, and everywhere she went, that evidence condemned her. Kyoto had survived the bombing. The ancient capital had been spared from the fire that consumed other cities. But survival did not mean prosperity. The streets were crowded with refugees from destroyed regions. Food was scarce. Occupation forces controlled essential supplies. And the population that had once believed in divine victory now struggled simply to exist. Ko found her family's neighborhood after hours of walking. Or what had been their neighborhood. The house where she grew up was gone. In its place stood a makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged wood and corrugated metal leaning against the ruins of what had once been their garden wall. She stood there for a long moment, unable to move. This was where her childhood had happened. This was where her parents had raised her, where her brother had learned to walk, where she had dreamed of becoming a nurse and helping people. Now it was rubble arranged into something barely resembling shelter. Her mother emerged first, an old woman Ko barely recognized. She had aged 20 years in the month since surrender. Her hair was gray now. Her face was lined with suffering. Her body was thin, so thin wrapped in clothing that had been patched and patched again until the original fabric was barely visible. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her mother's face crumpled. She ran forward with a cry that was half sob, half scream, and threw her arms around Ko with desperate strength. "You are alive! You are alive! You are alive!" The words repeated like a prayer. Ko held her mother and felt the bones beneath the skin, the terrible fragility of a body that had been starving for months. Her own body felt obscene by comparison. Solid, healthy, fed. Her father emerged next. He walked slowly, painfully, leaning on a makeshift cane. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were wet with tears. He embraced his daughter without speaking, holding her as if she might disappear. Her brother hung back. 15 years old now, but looking younger somehow. Small from malnutrition, eyes too old for his face. He stared at his sister with an expression she could not read. They went inside the shelter. There was barely room for 4 people. A single kerosene lamp provided dim light. Bedding was spread across the floor. A small cooking area held a pot containing something thin and watery that might generously be called soup. Ko looked at the soup, then at her mother's face, then at her brother's skeletal frame, and she understood exactly what her homecoming meant. She had survived. But her survival made no sense in this context. She had been cared for by the enemy while her family suffered under their own flag. She had eaten chocolate while her brother begged for rice. She had slept under wool blankets while her parents shivered in ruins. The guilt was unbearable. But what came next was worse. Her mother noticed the quality of her coat, the cleanliness of her clothes, the health radiating from her skin. And her mother said the words Ko had dreaded. "You look well." She paused. "They treated you well." "Yes." Silence. Her father looked away. Her brother's expression hardened. "How?" Her mother's voice was careful now. "How did you earn such treatment?" The accusation was gentle but unmistakable. Even her own mother suspected. Even the woman who had given her life was wondering what price had been paid for survival. Ko felt something break inside her. "I earned nothing," she said. "They gave it freely. The Americans followed rules. They fed all prisoners. They treated everyone the same. I did nothing except survive." Her mother wanted to believe her. Ko could see the struggle on her face. But doubt had been planted by months of rumors, by the propaganda that insisted American kindness was impossible, by the shame that attached to any woman who had been in enemy hands. Her brother spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, cold. "We starved. We ate grass and insects. Father almost died from sickness. Mother sold everything she owned for a handful of rice. And you were eating their food, living in their care, while we suffered here." It was not a question. It was an indictment. Ko wanted to explain, to tell them about the blankets and tea, about the Geneva Convention, about the kindness that had shattered her beliefs and rebuilt her understanding of the world. But how could she say those words in this shelter made of rubble? How could she praise American generosity to people who had lost everything while she gained weight in captivity? She could not. So she stayed silent. And her silence was interpreted as guilt. The days that followed were agony. Ko tried to help her family. She worked alongside her brother, clearing debris. She stood in ration lines with her mother. She gave away the American clothes she had arrived in wearing, instead the thin garments of the defeated. But nothing changed the fundamental truth. She was healthy in a nation of the starving. She had been treated well by the enemy, and that could not be forgiven. Her brother barely spoke to her. He worked long hours for inadequate pay and came home too exhausted for conversation. When he did speak, his words carried edges of resentment that cut deeper than any blade. "You chose to live," he said one night. "You could have died with honor. Instead, you let them feed you." Ko stared at him. This boy she had loved since his birth. This brother she had written letters to from Okinawa. He had become someone she did not recognize. "Would you prefer I had killed myself?" He did not answer, but his expression said yes. Yes, he would have preferred a dead sister to a living shame. Her parents tried to mediate. They loved their daughter. They were grateful she survived, but they too were trapped in the frameworks of belief that had governed Japanese life for generations. Surrender was shame. Captivity was dishonor. Survival in enemy hands required justification that could never be fully provided. Ko found herself increasingly isolated. She could not speak the truth about American kindness without seeming to praise the enemy. She could not explain the Geneva Convention without sounding like she was making excuses. She could not describe the blankets and tea without people assuming she had earned them through collaboration. The truth that had liberated her in captivity now imprisoned her in freedom. She was not alone in this experience. Throughout Japan, the women from that schoolhouse in Okinawa were facing similar receptions. Yumi, who had lost her entire family, lived now in a refugee camp where former POWs were housed separately, watched with suspicion. Sachiko, who had no family left to judge her, wandered the ruins of Hiroshima, searching for meaning in total destruction. They had survived. But survival in post-war Japan was its own form of torture. Months passed. Spring came to Kyoto. Cherry blossoms bloomed over ruins. Life continued in that strange way life always continues even after catastrophe. Ko found work as a nurse again. The occupation needed medical personnel. Her skills mattered more than her past. She treated Japanese patients and American soldiers alike, applying the same care to both, remembering the medics who had treated her with such unexpected gentleness. And slowly, carefully, she began to speak. Not publicly, not loudly, just to patients who would listen, to colleagues who asked questions, to anyone who seemed ready to hear a truth that contradicted everything they believed. The Americans are not what we were told. I know because they captured me. They could have done anything they wanted. Instead, they gave me blankets and tea. They fed me when my own country was letting my family starve. They showed me dignity when our government had told me to choose death. Everything we believed was a lie. Everything. Some people dismissed her. Some called her a traitor. Some reported her to occupation authorities as potentially subversive. But some listened. Some believed. Some recognized the truth in her words, because they too had begun to question the propaganda that had led Japan to destruction. The transformation spread slowly. One conversation at a time. One truth at a time. Seeds planted in the ruins of old beliefs, growing toward something new. Ko wrote in her journal late at night when her family slept. She recorded everything she remembered from captivity. The blankets, the tea, the American soldiers who showed her photographs of their families, the kindness that had destroyed her certainty and rebuilt her understanding. She wrote for herself. She wrote for history. She wrote because truth needed witnesses, even when witnesses were punished for what they saw. This story changed who I am, she wrote. It changed what I believe about enemies and about my own government. It proved that humanity can survive even when nations try to destroy it. And it taught me the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes your enemies will treat you better than your own leaders. Sometimes survival itself is an act of resistance against those who would prefer you dead. The occupation would last 7 years. Japan would transform from enemy to ally. Democracy would take root in soil fertilized by destruction, and the women who had been captured in Okinawa would live long enough to see their country rebuilt by the very Americans they had once been taught to hate. But the scars never fully healed. The guilt never completely faded. The memories of blankets and tea remained both comfort and accusation throughout their remaining years. In Part 4, we will see what happened decades later, how Ko finally shared her story publicly, how the women of Okinawa became witnesses to history, how blankets and tea became symbols of something larger than war, and how the lesson they learned in that ruined schoolhouse still matters today. Because some truths take a lifetime to understand, and some stories are never really over. In September 1945, 23 Japanese women huddled in a ruined schoolhouse on Okinawa, arms linked, prepared to die. They had been promised violation, torture, horrors beyond imagination. Instead, American soldiers brought them wool blankets and hot tea. That single act of unexpected kindness shattered everything they believed about enemies, about war, about their own government. In the months that followed, letters from home revealed an unbearable truth. While they ate 3 meals a day in captivity, their families starved in the ruins of Japan. The enemy was feeding prisoners. Their own nation was letting its citizens die. When repatriation came, these women returned to a homeland that viewed them with suspicion and shame. Their health was evidence of suspected collaboration. Their survival was a source of guilt. They had learned truths that nobody wanted to hear. But what happened in the decades that followed? What became of Ko, the nurse who kept a journal documenting everything? What legacy did those blankets and that tea leave behind? This story has one final chapter, and it contains a truth that took 50 years to speak aloud. Ko lived. She survived the suspicion. She endured the shame. She worked as a nurse through the occupation years, treating Japanese and Americans alike, carrying her secret knowledge like a wound that never fully healed. She married in 1952, a quiet man named Takeshi, who had spent the war working in a factory. He never asked about her time in Okinawa. She never volunteered. Their marriage was built on silence about the past, like so many marriages in post-war Japan. Some things were simply too painful to discuss. They had 2 children, a son in 1954, a daughter in 1957. Ko raised them with a quiet determination to give them something she had lost: the ability to think for themselves, the courage to question what they were told, the wisdom to see enemies as human beings. She never threw away her journal. It stayed hidden in a wooden box at the bottom of her closet, wrapped in the same cloth that had once held her knife. Sometimes late at night, when her family slept, she would take it out and read her own words from decades past. The blankets, the tea, the kindness that had destroyed her certainty. The other women scattered across Japan like seeds carried by wind. Yumi, the youngest, eventually married an American soldier she met during the occupation. They moved to California in 1955. She spent the rest of her life in a country she had once been taught to hate, raising children who spoke English as their first language. She never returned to Japan. Sachiko, who had lost her entire family, became a Buddhist nun. She spent 40 years in a temple in the mountains of Nagano, praying for the dead and counseling the living. When visitors asked about her past, she would tell them only this: "I learned that kindness is the sharpest weapon. It cuts through lies that violence only reinforces." The women rarely saw each other after repatriation. The shame of their shared experience kept them apart. To acknowledge each other was to acknowledge what had happened. And post-war Japan had no space for their truth. But time changes everything. Wounds that seem permanent slowly begin to heal. Shame that feels eternal gradually loses its power. And truths that could not be spoken eventually demand to be heard. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of Japan's surrender, a journalist named Yamamoto was researching women's experiences during the war. He had heard rumors about female prisoners in Okinawa who had been treated unusually well. He spent months tracking down survivors. Most refused to speak, but one agreed to meet him. Ko was 64 years old. Her children were grown. Her husband had died 3 years earlier. She had nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. The interview lasted 6 hours. Ko spoke about everything: the propaganda that had made her carry a knife, the boots on gravel, the door opening, the blankets and tea that made no sense, the meals that came day after day, the letters from home that shattered her world, the guilt that never fully faded, the return to a Japan that saw her as a traitor. She cried several times. So did the journalist. When the interview was published, it caused a sensation. Here was a first-hand account that contradicted the carefully maintained narrative of American brutality. Here was evidence that Japanese propaganda had lied about the enemy. Here was truth that many in Japan still did not want to accept. Ko received hate mail. She received death threats. Nationalists called her a collaborator, a liar, a disgrace to Japan. Some newspapers refused to print her story. Some historians questioned her credibility. But she also received other letters from women who had similar experiences, from families who had lost loved ones to suicide based on false propaganda, from young people who wanted to understand what had really happened, from Americans whose fathers and grandfathers had served in the Pacific and were relieved to know their actions had meant something. One letter came from California. It was from Yumi, who had read the article in a Japanese-language newspaper. She wrote about her life in America, about her children and grandchildren, about the husband who had once been an enemy soldier and became the love of her life, and about the blankets and tea that had changed everything. "They are still alive in me," Yumi wrote. "Every time I wrap myself in a warm blanket, I remember that night. Every time I drink tea, I taste the sweetness of unexpected mercy. We were taught that kindness from enemies was impossible. We learned that kindness from enemies was the only thing that could save us. But the legacy of that September night extended far beyond personal memory. It became part of a larger recognition that slowly transformed Japanese society. The Geneva Convention that the Americans had followed, the one Japan had rejected, became central to post-war Japanese identity. The new constitution renounced war. The new military operated under strict humanitarian guidelines. The lesson had been learned, written in the contrast between how Japan had treated prisoners and how Japan's prisoners had been treated. Historians began documenting the systematic lies of wartime propaganda. They traced how the government had deliberately created false narratives about American brutality to prevent surrenders, to encourage suicides, to maintain control over a population that might otherwise have demanded peace. The blankets and tea became symbols of this deception, evidence that the enemy had never been what they were told. International relations scholars studied the occupation of Japan as a model of post-war reconstruction. How do you transform an enemy into an ally? How do you rebuild a nation that has been devastated by war? Part of the answer, they concluded, lay in those small acts of humanity. The blankets, the tea, the meals that came day after day, the dignity that was offered to people who expected none. By treating former enemies as human beings worthy of care, the Americans had accomplished something that bombs and bullets never could. They had changed minds. They had shattered propaganda. They had proven through action what no words could have conveyed. The lesson extended beyond Japan. In subsequent conflicts, the treatment of prisoners became increasingly central to military strategy. The Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. Each conflict brought new debates about how to handle captured enemies, and the example of Japan, where humane treatment had helped transform a bitter enemy into a close ally, was cited again and again. One study estimated that the humanitarian approach to occupation saved hundreds of thousands of lives that would have been lost to continued resistance. Another calculated that the economic benefits of the U.S.-Japan alliance, built on the foundation of post-war reconciliation, exceeded trillions of dollars over the following decades. The blankets and tea had been cheap. Their return on investment was incalculable. But the deepest legacy was not economic or strategic. It was moral. It was the proof that even in war's darkest hour, humanity can survive. That enemies are always human beings, capable of both cruelty and compassion. That the choice between them is always available, no matter how much hatred has been accumulated. Ko understood this better than anyone. She had entered captivity believing Americans were monsters. She had left knowing they were people, and that transformation had been accomplished not through arguments or evidence or propaganda of any kind. It had been accomplished through wool blankets on a cold night, through hot tea sweetened with sugar, through small acts of care that contradicted everything she had been taught. In her final years, Ko spoke frequently at schools and universities. She told her story to young people who had never known war. She showed them her journal. She described the fear and the confusion and the slow, painful process of recognizing that everything she believed had been false. The lesson she emphasized was always the same. Question what you are told about enemies. Look for the humanity in people you are taught to hate. Remember that propaganda exists to make you stop thinking. And never forget that kindness offered freely to those who have no power to demand it reveals more about character than any amount of proclaimed loyalty. She died in 1997 at the age of 76. Her granddaughter was at her bedside. Ko's final gift to her was the journal and the blanket she had kept for 52 years. "Remember this," she whispered. "Remember that kindness from an unexpected source has more power than any weapon. Remember that propaganda always lies about the enemy's humanity. And remember that survival is not betrayal. Living to tell the truth is the greatest form of resistance." But here is the detail that almost no one knows. The twist that makes this story complete. In 2015, researchers discovered documents in American military archives that revealed something extraordinary. The soldiers who brought blankets and tea to that schoolhouse on September 7, 1945, were not following specific orders. There was no directive requiring them to provide comfort to prisoners that night. The Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment, but it did not specify blankets and tea. The soldiers had done it on their own initiative. A sergeant named Robert Miller had noticed that the night was cold. He had seen the women shivering through the damaged walls of the schoolhouse, and he had simply decided to help. He requisitioned blankets from supply. He had the mess prepare tea with extra sugar because he thought frightened people might need something warm and sweet. He brought 2 other soldiers with him because he did not want the women to feel threatened by a single man entering in darkness. There were no medals for what he did, no commendations, no official recognition. He never knew the impact of his actions. He returned to Ohio after the war, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and died in 1989 without ever learning that his simple act of kindness had transformed 23 lives and eventually contributed to the reconciliation of 2 nations. His granddaughter found his war diary in 2016 while clearing out his house after her grandmother's death. In it, he had written a single line about that night. "Brought blankets to the Jap women prisoners. They looked cold and scared. Felt like the right thing to do. That was all. Felt like the right thing to do. No grand philosophy, no strategic calculation, no awareness that he was making history. Just a man who saw cold, frightened people and chose to help." Ko never met Robert Miller. She never knew his name. But his decision to do the right thing changed her life more profoundly than any battle, any bomb, any act of war. And the fact that he did it without expectation of reward or recognition makes it all the more powerful. This is the true story of blankets and tea in Okinawa, September 1945. It began with propaganda so effective that women chose death over surrender. It continued with a simple act of kindness that shattered everything those women believed. It extended through decades of silence and shame, then decades more of slowly emerging truth. And it ended with the discovery that the man behind it all never knew what he had done. From 23 terrified women expecting assault to a transformation that helped rebuild a nation. From wool blankets and hot tea to a lesson about humanity that echoes across generations. From one sergeant who felt like doing the right thing to a legacy that proved kindness is the sharpest weapon. Ko wrote the final entry in her journal 3 days before she died. Her handwriting was shaky, but her words were clear. 52 years ago, I was ready to kill myself rather than face American captivity. I had a knife. I was prepared to use it. Then the door opened, and instead of horror, I received warmth. Instead of violence, I received care. And everything I believed crumbled to dust. I have spent my life trying to understand what happened that night. Now at the end, I finally do. It was not strategy. It was not policy. It was not calculation. It was simply humanity surviving despite everything war does to destroy it. The Americans who brought those blankets did not know they were changing history. They were just being kind. And that is the lesson I want to leave behind. You never know when your small act of decency will shatter someone's certainty. You never know when your simple kindness will save a life. You never know when choosing compassion over cruelty will echo across decades and transform nations. So choose kindness, always, even when no one is watching. especially when no one is watching. Because that is when it matters most. If this story moved you, consider what small act of kindness you might offer today. To a stranger, to someone you disagree with, to someone your society tells you to fear. You may never know the impact, but the impact may be greater than you can imagine. This is one of thousands of forgotten stories from World War II. Stories of ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. Stories that reveal the complicated humanity behind the headlines. If you want to hear more, subscribe and join us as we uncover the truths that history almost forgot. Because the greatest weapon is not the one that destroys the body. It is the one that destroys the lie. And sometimes that weapon is nothing more than a warm blanket and a cup of tea.